Okay. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much for joining the first day of presentations for our seminar on Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa. We have three presenters today, Dr. Sami al-Daghistani, Sahil, Jamal, I hope, Dr. Sahil, I didn't butcher your name. Please do correct me.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Right.
And Dr. Asim Padela. We'll go in that order. We'll start with Dr. Sami al-Daghistani, who received his PhD in Islamic Studies from Leiden University with co-supervision at Columbia University. He is an associate faculty member at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, a research scholar at the Middle East Institute at Columbia University, and a postdoctoral fellow at the Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society in Oslo, Norway. His teaching and research focus on Islamic intellectual history, especially economic and environmental thought, and Islam and modernity. Our second speaker, Jamal, is a Maulana Azad Junior Research Fellow at the University of Hyderabad, India. His interdisciplinary research focuses on the engagements of Muslim community with colonial and post-colonial state in South India, musing on the jurisprudential developments. His area of research include identity, community, religion, constitutionalism, secularism, modernity, state and minorities, and interpretive mechanisms. Dr. Asim Padela is an internationally recognized thought and research leader in the fields of Muslim health disparities and Islamic bioethics. In addition to leading the initiative on Islam and medicine, he maintains an active clinical research and clinical ethics practice at the Medical College of Wisconsin. As a scholar, Dr. Padela's focus is on the intersections of healthcare, bioethics, and religion. Welcome, all of you. Thank you very much for submitting your papers. We are really looking forward to the conversation that is about to follow. The format of the presentations is for this symposium, that is for today and the next 2 days, Tuesday and Wednesday, is going to be as follows. Each of the presenters is going to present for 20 minutes, followed by comments by a commentator for 10 minutes, and ultimately final comments by the presenter responding to the comments for 5 minutes at the end. So 20 minutes and then 10 minutes and then 5 minutes, final comment, and then we'll move to the next presenter. Our first presenter will be Dr. Sami al-Daghistani, and then Dr. Sahil, Jamal, and then Dr. Asim Padela. I hope it is clear. And then at the end, we're going to open the session to Q&A in general. All right, so without further ado, Dr. Sami al-Daghistani, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers for putting this symposium together and for having me. And thank you again to Dr. Kamali for his keynote yesterday as well. I very much look forward to today's discussion and also to other sessions in the following days. Just a note that I have revised parts of the paper since I submitted it to you guys. So you might find a few discrepancies between the two papers, and this just reflects the direction that I'm taking the essay. So my paper analyzes economic provision or acquisition of wealth, or al-kasb in Islamic tradition, primarily through maslaha and adab as ethical concepts. In this paper, I explore maslaha's relation to the ethos of adab as extension of Sharia's moral law and other equally important yet neglected conceptualizations that complement ethically driven economic engagements, often expressed through the stations of maqamat that include the concepts of wara, zuhd, and faqr. One of the main premises is not to show that Sufi literature provides all the answers to various economic predicaments in Islamic tradition. Far from it. After all, many scholars were not Sufis themselves, but only resorted to particular Sufi conceptualizations, but rather that adab is closely associated with maslaha and complements, in my opinion, the study of economic history by offering vistas for analyzing economic engagements as part of cultivating the inner self and maintaining virtuous character. So I will concentrate on the understanding of kasb in economic affairs and think conceptually and critically about maslaha as an ethical category that corresponds with adab's more holistic vision of human nature when invoking the notions of economic provision and welfare. The main question that I try to provide answer to is what constitutes economic provision in classical Islamic thought and upon which methods, concepts, and predisposition it is founded. First, I will briefly address the theoretical considerations of Maqāṣid and Maslaha as reflected in the writings of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Following that, I analyze certain classical Muslim scholars who wrote on kasb, such as al-Shaybani, al-Muhasibi, Ibn Abi al-Dunya, al-Mawardi, and again, al-Ghazali. I argue that Islamic scholarship had a different understanding of economics from the classical economic science that was invoked through kasb or al-iqtisad and their ethical dimensions. So acquiring or dealing with wealth was neither a technical manner nor a legal obligation, but primarily a moral engagement that harkens to the technology of self-examination. Such a vision of the moral self and economic development was inextricably related to the spiritual qualities of iqtisad and thus aimed at securing the well-being of an individual and community. As a theologian and adherent of tasawwuf, and in essence, I would argue an ethicist, al-Ghazali elaborated on the Maqāṣid in the context of, as we already know, safeguarding the 5 categories of deen, nafs, aql, nasl, and mal. The very idea of preservation of these 5 categories explicates not only legal, but also ethical concerns, for the former are subsumed by the latter. The claim that Maqāṣid entails the gist of Sharia law presupposes that it deals with ethical aspects of legal norms, whereby ideas of justice and social welfare are contextualized as metaphysical axioms. So the preservation of 5 categories, including the preservation of wealth, or hifd al-mal, hence takes into consideration economic and commercial activities such as allocation of wealth, circulation of money, and intentions behind one's action, which are viewed as ethically driven endeavors. Given that the concept of maslaha has remained primarily in the backdrop of Islamic legal discourse, it was rarely discussed in the context of cosmological and metaphysical qualities of economic thought. Barter exchange, property rights, acquisition of wealth, and other economic mechanisms employ both material or worldly and non-material or spiritual reading and are part and parcel of the Quranic metaphysical system that undergirds large parts of Islamic intellectual tradition. More specifically, for al-Ghazali, maslaha as an integral part of Maqāṣid means observing and fulfilling objectives of the lawgiver, which are moral in essence. In his encyclopedic Ihya Ulumuddin, he clearly states that fiqh is an ethical category, and that was with time made to refer only to the technical side of the law. So al-Ghazali informs us that fiqh, quote, has become a specialized branch of fatwas and waqfs on small details about them and excessive debate surrounding them. The meaning of fiqh in the first period was, however, undisputably linked to the science of the path of the hereafter, right? Knowledge of the details of harmful matters of the self and that which corrupts human action, understanding of indulging the wickedness of the world, perseverance for reaching the grace of the hereafter, and God's fierce domination over the heart, end of quote. So in more economic terms, Al-Ghazali asserts that the value of human labor does not rest on the idea of gaining profit, whereas the production of basic necessities for the public good is perceived as a social and individual obligation, or fard kifaya. It is hence safe to say that all economic conduct is seen in light of benefit and disutility, masalih or maqāṣid, permeated by the moral law. This presupposes that economic and commercial activities are part of the higher objectives of Sharia, whereby one tries to increase maslaha instead of utility in a conventional sense. Al-Shaybani, Al-Muhasibi, Ibn Abi al-Dunya, Al-Tusi, Al-Mawardi, Al-Isfahani, in addition to Al-Ghazali, all wrote on kasb and zuhd in light of the benefit they possess. While not all scholars belong to the tradition of tasawwuf or refer to maslaha directly, they examine the notion of well-being or social benefit when theorizing economic behaviors. Those legal scholars and theologians address, broadly speaking, economic ideas in ethical terms, often embedded in the ethos of adab as an articulation of virtuous traits of character. Second, in addition to maslaha, the stations of maqamat as an embodiment of both mystical knowledge and Islamic law through the moral reconfiguration of the human soul can be reconsidered within the context of preserving welfare when discussing economic predicaments. And in the following pages, I showcase some of those scholars and then their economic philosophy. So while the term adab etymologically relates to da'ab as custom or habit and carries both ethical and practical meaning as high quality of soul or even urbanity or courtesy, after the 7th century, it acquired also an intellectual meaning as the sum of knowledge that makes one courteous. In the classical period, adab carried polyvalent, multiple functions, some of which designated as a social education, traditional mannerism, shaping of character, or even literature. Today, it is closely associated with akhlaq or ethics, yet akhlaq became prevalent in the modern period, in part also due to the rise of political Islam and its more Puritan interpretations. The term adab and its derivatives demonstrate an understanding of integrative moral education pertaining to good character and nobility. So the outward actions are thus bound to inner certitudes. In other words, in the context of adab, one's daily economic activities, including purchases, sales, participation in barter exchange, and dealing with wealth in general, mirrors one's inner predisposition, moral behavior, as well as social responsibilities. Maqamat can be in this light obtained through a rigorous spiritual exercise and devotion through daily activities as an aspect of one's religious life. This relationality further provides an insight into the correlation between earning or acquiring wealth, kasb, and extramundane detachment or zuhd. One, however, purifies one's heart also by purifying one's wealth through engaging in fair economic activities such as providing for one's family and paying zakat. So zuhd does not mean rejecting the world as it has been often interpreted, but rather inner worldly asceticism. Al-Qurayshi famously said that renunciation is to give up both the dinar and the dirham, right? The golden dinar and the silver dirham. Such an attitude does not convey that wealth is a sin or that profit is illicit, but rather that one has to constantly re-examine one's own attachment to the material world and economic matters. It was, however, al-Shaybani's Kitab al-Kasb among the first to study not only legal, but also more traditional and ethical themes of economic engagement, arguably merging legal precepts of Sharia with moral reverberations of wealth and poverty. For al-Shaybani, kasb as individual and collective activity has to be considered for the public good or maslaha. Al-Shaybani holds that kasb contributes towards common good since one can provide first for one's own family and second for the community. Kasb then pertains to basic needs and necessities such as food, clothing, and shelter. Al-Muhasibi, who was a Shafi jurist and a Sufi whose intellectual influence can also be found in Al-Ghazali, believed that when engaged in economic activities and earning a living, one should also exercise mindfulness, remembrance, or dhikr, closeness to God, al-taqarrub, and purifying one's heart, taharat al-qulub. By navigating the worldly life, one has to balance then between miserliness and expenditure in preserving one's dignity. In his Kitab Ta'dib al-Murid, he further describes an educational scheme, Ta'dib, on how to govern oneself throughout the day, including economic postulates, indicating that kasb is to be obtained first and foremost by one's fair earnings. Ibn Abi al-Dunya perceived wealth as both belonging to the material and the moral realm, while addressing spiritual qualities of economic behavior. He analyzes beneficial functions of money as a divine generosity. Charity, for instance, has to be given by everyone who possesses money. However, saving money is a virtue on its own right because it can benefit others, while unnecessary spending might bring upon harm. Al-Mawardi's Adab al-Dunya wal-Din deals not only with Islamic law and tradition, but also with the cultivation of personal virtues or adab. Social inequalities, Al-Mawardi informs us, are a natural progression. However, they can be advantageous only if there is a cooperation between different groups of people and industries, whereas the governmental authority is required to guarantee an equitable distribution of income. To create a welfare society, the governmental authority then regulates and manages public finances, revenues, levies zakat, and provides benefits to the members of the community from the treasury. Adab as a moral education is for Mawardi the discipline of body, mind, and soul associated with cultivating economic awareness in terms of securing just conduct in markets, minimizing harm when engaging with barter exchange, and providing food for community. The pinnacle of the ethical economic genre, how I'll call it, in Islamic tradition is, however, Al-Ghazali, who provided a detailed account on economic engagements by combining both, I would argue, philosophical reasoning and Sufi conceptualizations in the context of his theory of eternal happiness, or Sa'ada. Now, Sa'ada permeates his theological, legal, and Sufi thought, and it encompasses also the very concept of maslaha as benefit. He often referenced other Sufi scholars, including al-Muhasibi and al-Isfahani, when discussing economic ideas. Al-Ghazali's economic thought, which is primarily found in the third book of the second volume of Ihya, titled Kitab Adab al-Kasb wal-Ma'ash, and is centered on his theory of the science of the hereafter, Ilm Tariq al-Akhirah, is part of his overall ethical system or moral epistemology, aiming at reviving the lost religious sciences of the day. Economic activities, which one is expected to perform on a daily basis, form an important part of that system. Al-Ghazali asserts that poverty means being independent from worldly desires, while at the same time maintaining a healthy engagement with the phenomenal world. He upholds that ihsan has to be practiced in the market as an act of generosity, and cautions that one should take only that much of goods from this world as it is absolutely necessary for one's life. Likewise, the level of consumption has to then be balanced between necessity and extravagance. Since the ultimate goal of trade and commerce is for Al-Ghazali not in gaining profits for the sake of making money, but the remembrance of the hereafter, one's engagement has to be beneficial for the wider community. While money has been created in order to fulfill basic human needs, one should seek balance when dealing with it and avoid miserliness. And miserliness is defined as excessive restriction on expenditure and extravagance, which is excessive spending of wealth. So since having wealth also opened doors for possible enjoyment of illicit pleasures, he constantly draws attention to the fact that money does not possess an intrinsic value, but rather that its value lies in that it facilitates exchange of commodities. Adab as the inner disposition of the soul and the practice of self-examination geared towards spiritual closeness to the divine is hence part of his science of the unveiling, or ilm al-mukashafa. It encompasses voluntary acts as virtuous traits of character, and it's neither a term reserved specifically for the tradition of tasawwuf, nor is it disassociated from Sharia's law, but rather subsumed one's moral compass. The theoretical consideration of adab as a moral formulation correlates to praxis of renouncing excessive economic gains within the context of the purification of the heart, and is often invoked together with maslaha as benefit. Al-Ghazali cautions that spiritual guidance based on adab is ultimately about taqwa, an inward consciousness of the divine that brings about poised character. In conclusion, mechanisms such as charity, sadaqah, alms tax, zakat, and institutions such as charitable trust funds or waqf and supervision of markets, hizbah, were in the classical period not only conceived within the legal realm of Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa, the preservation of the common good or maslaha, and policy-oriented governance or siyasa shari'iyya, but were also contrived through the concept of adab as moral mannerism and personal strivings to attain the divine. In light of such understanding, ethical concerns formed the gist of economic thought. Questions on economic justice or adl, prohibition of usury, riba, just governance, ahkam al-sultaniyya, and well-being were by classical scholars discussed in legal texts, theological works, and Sufi treatises. These scholars believed that implementing the concept of justice was crucial for providing welfare to community that was not only a matter of legal injunction or political decision, but rather a moral issue embedded in how one performs and cultivates righteous character. So acquiring wealth, redistribution of goods, participating in trade, and supervising market regulations were by the aforementioned scholars conceived in relation to commercials law, mu'amalat, that were, however, studied not only as legal injunctions, but also as ethical categories complementing acts of worship or ibadat. From this vantage point, it is viable to view ethical economic genre in Islamic tradition not simply as an amalgamation of legal and economic obligations, but rather as a specific contribution within that tradition whereby personal traits and virtuous behavior are constantly foregrounded in the notion of common good through the intricacy of moral principles. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this really fascinating connection between kasb, earning, the economic activity, and adab. I think it's a really appropriate beginning for a seminar on Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa because it brings the heart of the Sharia together with the heart of the economic activity. I'm looking forward to developed paper as you bring it into conversation with the other papers that you will see it as you will interact with in this seminar. But I also wanted to draw your attention to some bodies of literature and some conceptual questions that you might want to clarify. It seems to me that your intention is to suggest the distinctive contribution of Sufism, particularly as it developed in the thought of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, in this economic activity. And you take, of course, the idea of adab, the proper etiquette of, that's how I translate it, of engaging in this economic activity. You also, so there are a number of things. Conceptually, you seem to suggest that adab rather than akhlaq is a more proper translation for the ethical side that you want to bring out. You also suggest that the term akhlaq has been emphasized by political Islam, whereas in the classical period that you're talking about, adab seems to reign supreme. I find these characterizations to be somewhat ahistorical, and there are a number of points, if you will, I'd like you to take into account as you develop your paper. First, you may be familiar with the development of zuhud in early Islam in the centuries before al-Ghazali, when there is in fact quite a bit of struggle, if you will, in the 3rd century between a branch of Sufis and the fuqaha and traditionalists. And the struggle is that the Sufis begin to say that kasb is haram, which is that you simply cannot find anything that is halal, that is permissible and licit and pure. And therefore, the only activity that you could engage in that is legitimate work is begging. So, in fact, it is the traditionalists and the fuqaha who campaign against this understanding, as you may be familiar. And of course, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, rahimahullah, has a book, Kitab al-Zuhud. Others, Kitab al-Kasb, that you mentioned of al-Shaybani, you seem to want to incorporate them all as part of one whole, but what we have is a struggle in which Sufism is disciplined in this movement by the fuqaha. And it's not the other way around until it is in Imam al-Ghazali, who is first and foremost a faqih, who is, if you will, seeking entry into Sufism, and not the other way around. Historically, Imam al-Ghazali is not a recognized Sufi master of his time. He is rather a great jurist and a theorist and an usuli and a faqih who wants to bring Sufi insights into the mainstream. And in the process, in Ihya Ulum al-Din, what Imam al-Ghazali is doing is not historical. It's rather a little bit of diplomacy. And so what I suggest is that you take into account history as well as his act of diplomacy, rather than reading his suggestions as being historical. Because there is, of course, a tremendous amount of literature that shows, some of these conflicts and negotiations that are taking place in early Islamic history, 3rd century, 4th century. And I might point you to the recent work by Christopher Melchert on tasawwuf, right? The emergence of tasawwuf from Zuhud tradition. But there is a lot of other literature, if you're interested, and happy to provide it both in Arabic and English. Second observation I want to make is, you correctly point out the insightful, even originality of Imam al-Ghazali's economic thought. But there is emerging literature that looks at the influence of Greek thought on al-Ghazali on the questions, particularly questions of Maqāṣid. You may want to look at Professor Ahmed al-Shamsi's article, Two Theories of Wisdom in Islamic Law, in which he traces the influence of Galenic medicine and his observation of the if you will, the great wisdom, divine wisdom in human body, and which had become available to Arabic readers, around that time. And Al-Ghazali uses almost the same phraseology that is available in the Arabic translation of Galen and other Greek texts in describing Islamic law. And my point simply, and of course, similarly, we have to take into account the influence of Greek writers and Hellenic writers, such as Bryson, and their economic teachings, if you will. And the reason I say it's important for us to pay attention to this is that, of course, because Islamization is an important consideration, right? And for much of contemporary writing, and then the interest in recognizing what is and what isn't Islamic, and to what extent extra-Islamic economic institutions or wisdom or observations can be brought into the ethical mix, if you will, of Islam. But clearly for our classical writers like Al-Ghazali, this incorporation of this wisdom from pagans was clearly, if it met their purpose and their understanding, and enlightened their understanding, was acceptable. And one could then similarly argue, well, why not accept capitalism from another foreign source that is coming from similar extra-Islamic considerations? So my point is to historicize it and trace these, either historicize and trace these influences, or perhaps signpost in your presentation that you are trying to get into Al-Ghazali's worldview rather than presenting history. You might also mention and reflect on, this is not something that necessarily changes your narrative, but I think it would be interesting. I was looking for the reference, but I couldn't find in your paper, on recent work that suggests that, the beginnings of capitalism lie in Islamic thought, and Al-Ghazali's observations had quite a bit to do with it. I don't quite know whether I find it persuasive myself, but I wonder what you would think of it. Also, similar historical point on the question of adab versus akhlaq. If I understand correctly, adab emerges in the current form in Abbasid courts. Not exactly, right? It's not something that is coming out of the Quran or the Sunnah or even fiqh discourse. It is rather a development of Islamic civilization. And it is over time that adab then becomes understood more generally and broadly as etiquette. And of course, its meaning earlier on, even in the hadith literature, means something close to teaching, as the Prophet ﷺ says that my Lord ta'addabani, my Lord did my tarbiyah and taught me. So it means teaching. And also, you seem to suggest a strong connection between kasb, as I pointed out earlier, and Sufism. And of course, I think that classical Shara'i Sufism after al-Ghazali does pick up on this idea, and as I said earlier on, the relationship is one more of tension, right? Rather than Sufism introducing this idea of spirituality of kasb. Sufism had, in fact, it is the fiqh that does that. But also I wanted to point out that already right in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, we have an emphasis on the religious importance of kasb as an ethical activity, right? Because it is there are some weak hadiths that make very strong statements, and there are some strong hadiths that nevertheless have a very positive depiction of working, both tijara, but also labor. And so from the very beginning, the fuqaha understand earning as earning to put food, if you will, on the table as a man's obligation. And I think that what Kitab Ihya Ulumuddin is doing is looking at all of the mundane activities and providing the proper demeanor for those activities, proper etiquette for those activities. So I wonder if you could reflect more on this aspect of your suggestion in your as you further develop the paper. Right? That rather than somehow kasb being transformed as a result of this encounter with classical Sufism, it is already found in the very fiqh, the technical fiqh that Imam al-Ghazali both is a master of at the one hand, and then he almost uses it as a foil to bring Sufism in, right? And this is something that, so you said fiqh has become too worldly, and here is why we need Sufism. Of course, scholars, even in Ghazali's time, found this to be a problematic characterization of fiqh, and have others ever since. So my point is simply, I think that your observations as what Imam Ghazali is trying to do, they track better with him than with the conversations and historical development of which he is part. Thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you. Would you like me to briefly respond to any of these issues?
Yes, 5 minutes. Yeah, 5 minutes.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Ovamir. I appreciate these comments and your close reading and analysis of the papers and also its major points. I will just pick on a couple of them, a couple of the issues that you raised. First, I wholeheartedly agree about the development of Zuhd and also Kasb on the other hand, right? It started way before al-Ghazali, right? And that's why I said that al-Ghazali comes as, in some instances, as a pinnacle of that ethical economic genre, what I would call it, right? And that's why I think al-Shaybani also wrote his piece, Kitab al-Kasb, that comes out of that tension. On one hand, he's criticizing the Sufis, right? But particular type of Sufis, right? Those that are those that go along the side of like begging. And he's in his Kitab al-Kasb, he's actually in detail discussing not only kasb then as acquisition of wealth, but also poverty or faqr, right? Which is actually equally important concept in this debate. So faqr has various meanings. One can be the social poverty the other can be more of a spiritual poverty. This is something that it's again reflected in Isfahani's piece, but also later on in Al-Ghazali's piece. So obviously these points are well taken, and I will definitely try to implement it, moving forward and developing the paper further. But one of the overarching kind of aims of the paper is to show that there is a different type of literature on Qasb, that it's not found only in fiqh manuals or fiqh texts, right? That there is this group of scholars, if you will, starting with al-Shaybani and al-Muhasibi, Ibn Abil Dunya, al-Isfahani, and al-Ghazali, that equally discuss the legal importance of acquisition of wealth, but in the same breath, these things are not disassociated from further moral or even ethical considerations, right? As far as the historicizing, I agree. The point is that maybe then starting on with or focusing more on the Shaybani's piece might bring things into historical perspective, and then later on focusing on Al-Ghazali for specific reasons that I pointed out, right? But there is a growing also literature that points to the fact that indeed a early rudimental form of capitalism was developed, for instance, in early Islam, which is something that I would actually disagree with, right? Benedict Kohler, I think, produced one book a few years back. And there is also other type of literature that points that, well, whatever the early Muslim scholars devised is not so different than what the Greeks have already taught. And I would also disagree with that type of reasoning as well. Number one, because I think there is something called the Sharia's moral law, which a lot of scholars kind of position their ideas in, especially on the notion of acquisition of wealth, poverty as a social, but also spiritual category, and zuhd. So this is something to say that it's those type of this type of scholarship is not found only in Sufi texts, right? It's very hard to position, for instance, Kitab al-Qasb al-Shaybani on one hand being resorting to some sort of a Sufi conceptualization, but on the other hand, we all know Shaybani is a legal scholar as well, first and foremost, right? And the same goes for Al-Ghazali. This is this is just not to repeat myself, because these types of questions I've been trying to discuss in my other work, right? And that's why I said what is really important, or how I see my contribution to this particular symposium, and inshallah to the edited volume, is really merging together more, or connecting the tissues between the maslaha or the masalih and the adab. And then this brings me to the final point, where how does actually adab really function in this debate, and how is it different from akhlaq? I think I would agree with you that I see adab as a overarching concept, whereas akhlaq is sometimes associated strictly with ethics. And I don't think that, looking back into the Islamic intellectual tradition, it's sometimes difficult to disassociate morals from ethical systems, right? And this is actually clearly espoused in Ihya Ulumuddin, but also in other types of work. So I think that ethics and morality go hand in hand, and the two cannot be actually, fully disassociated from one another. So adab is just used as an overarching concept that really explains a lot of both one's moral orientation, if you will, but also a broader ethical systems that are at place in those types of work. But yeah, as I mentioned, moving forward, I gladly take up these points. And I'm so looking forward to the discussion. I'm sure that, moving forward today and also in the next few days, it's going to be, number one, fruitful, not only for my paper, but also to kind of develop further some of these thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sami al-Daghistani. I think your paper was a really, I think, appropriate beginning for our symposium, and very well written, very well presented. Thank you very much once again for being part of our symposium. Let us turn now to...
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Let's turn now to Sahil Jamal Kiliamano. You have 20 minutes. Please take it away.
Is there a way can I present my PPT? I have a PPT.
Yes, do you see share screen?
Yeah, but it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay. If the IT department, could you please enable Dr. Kiliamano's presentation, make him a co-host?
Is it happening or?
I actually don't know. Is IT department here?
I'm calling him, Dr. Awaimer.
Okay,
I tried to do it myself, but I couldn't.
all right.
You should be able to do it now, Tahir. Can you try, please?
Yeah. Is it visible now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for including me in this symposium. So my paper is largely about Muslim movements in India and how there is a turn within these Muslim movements, which can be described as a Maqāṣid turn after 1990s. So to give a brief idea about the context, I will very briefly explain the context of my research or the case study which I'm looking at into. So there were a lot of Muslim organizations in South India, especially in the state of Kerala, before 1990. And they were named as Kerala Muslim Aikya Sangam, Kerala Jamiyatul Ulama, Tablighi Jamaat, Samasta Kerala Jamiyatul Ulama, Jamaat-e-Islam-e Hind, Kerala Nadwatul Mujahideen, etc. When we look at these movements, we can clearly see that they have a general characteristics of retaining their religious naming pattern itself. And their larger audience were the Muslim community, and they were described as religious sects rather than Muslim movements. However, the changes which were happening in the national and the regional level as well as the international level has drastically affected these Muslim movements. Especially in India after 1970s, a lot of controversies and issues were happening, and towards the end, it culminated with the demolition of Babari Masjid in 1992. At the similar time, in the international level, the Islamic revolution in Iran, Soviet defeat in Afghan, the Gulf War, all these were having repercussions in India as well. Then what happened? Then there are new kind of movements coming up in the Muslim community, and they were named as this: People's Democratic Party, Popular Front of India, Solidarity Youth Movement, and there were different other parties as well. So there is a visible shift in the pattern of naming itself. The movements change from the standard Islamic names towards a more kind of secular or constitutional kind of naming. However, the slogans of these movements are also quite interesting. For example, People's Democratic Party have this slogan called "Power to Awareness, Liberation for the Oppressed," while the Popular Front of India have the slogan "Freedom from Hunger and Freedom from Fear." Solidarity Youth Movement talks about the revolution itself. So general characteristics of these movements is that they talks more about constitutional rights, and they imagine Islam in a new way, so that they started debating about the issues of caste, gender, community, even environment and nation. And that's how they changed their priorities towards environmental activism, gender justice, human rights, and all. For example, these are some of the pictures of these movements in which they are doing different kinds of struggle. The one in which you can see is about the movements banning Coca-Cola and Pepsi and all. This is Popular Front of India, and they are demanding reservation to Muslims in employment and education. And this is PDP, and the slogan that is written in Malayalam language is Avarna Aikyam, which means the solidarity of lower caste or Avarna communities. So what's happening here? What I propose is that there is a Maqāṣid turn in these movements, which we can see when we analyze these movements more closely. For example, Popular Front of India gives the in their constitution, they say that they are an organization which is moving towards coordination and management of such efforts for the achievement of socio-economic, cultural, and political empowerment of the deprived and the downtrodden and the nation at large. It will try to establish egalitarian society in which freedom, justice, and security are enjoyed by all. I want you to focus on these terms of freedom, justice, and security. Similarly, Abdul Nasser Mahadani, who was the chairman of People's Democratic Party, he says that I am a committed Muslim, and every Muslim has an obligation to support the poor, Adivasis, and Dalits. It's my duty to stand by you to fight for your rights, if indeed to be a martyr dying for this cause. In the same way, Solidarity Youth Movement uses this caption, Janasevanam Deivaradhanayana, which means serving humanity is worshipping God. And they describe themselves as a group of youth committed to justice and welfare. So here we can see how they are having a kind of Maqāṣid turn in politics. When it comes to the environmental issues, Samat Kunnaka, who is the secretary of the Solidarity Youth Movement, he writes, solidarity has become the perfect representation of the Quran, which touches man's naval connection to the soil through the concept of man being born from the soil and returning to the soil. Solidarity has timely introduced the Quranic theme of human habitation in harmony with the nature. The Quran, which depicts a strong nation and a clean society, inhabiting it emphasizes the need for a clean environment. The Quranic metaphors of pure air, rihun tayyib, pure soil, pure water, Mount Tahur, all these are kind of a dream of an unpolluted air, soil, and water. The religion of the prophets teaches that the word you in Allah's word, all that is on earth was created for you, includes all human beings until the end of the world. So they're talking about how to save the environment for generations. And Solidarity sought to incorporate the philosophy of nature in the Quran and the words of Prophet into the environmental struggles in Kerala. Similarly, the other movement, which is Students Islamic Organization, which is an offshoot of Jamaat-e-Islami, they had a conference in which one particular section was devoted to fiqh and usulul fiqh, and they had debates on Maqāṣid Sharia as well. However, what I'm focusing is on the campaign which was run by this Student Islamic Organization. They had a campaign with the slogan "Go Green," and they made these three things as their aims: to abide by the teachings of Islam, which view a sound nexus between living beings and the natural order, thus providing a strong foundation for peaceful and healthier coexistence. to create massive awakening among human beings and reminding their human responsibility to take care of the environment and protect natural resources. And more interestingly, the Student Islamic Organization of India described their Islamic environmental practice based on 4 principles, principles of Tawheed, Khilafah, Akhirah, and Mizan. To study these movements and the shift which is happening in these movements, there are some existing approaches that there are some existing studies which define some certain approaches. Majorly, most of the scholars talked about a kind of return of religion. All the post-secular scholars largely talks about a return of religion, as if religion has went or vanished somewhere in the 1970s or 80s. Even Dr. Wael Hallak says that there is an impulse of modernity which has created a deep sense of moral laws, which has led to the formation of Islamist movements itself. And this regarding the shift within the Islamist movements, Niloufar Gold says there are 2 phases within these movements. So in the first phase, there is a quest for Islamic identity, there is a radicalization, Islamic militancy. While in the second phase, there is a decline of ideological fervor, giving way to multiplicity of authorities and multiplicity of voices within these movements. And then different scholars try to talk about this second phase through different names. Asaf Bayat famously talks about post-Islamism to characterize this second phase, while Robert Hefner coins the term civil Islam to talks about the Muslim engagements with the modern kind of nation state, while Gilles Kepels talks about Islamist democracy to talk about the Islamist movement's engagement with the modern nation state and democracy. Salvatore and Eckermann talks about public Islam to talk about this same thing. When it comes to the Muslim movements in India, actually, there are not enough studies which are good enough to characterize these movements. So the existing approaches to the study of Muslim community in India takes some of the already existing rubrics. They either talk about the minority position or the syncretic elements within the Muslim community, and talking about how the Indian Muslim community is different from the Arabian Islam, and how there is a continuous process of Islamization that is happening within Muslim community. And the other group of scholars talks about the Muslim identity in India as a reminiscence of the colonial practice and all. And when it comes to the studies on Muslim community in South India, it's again very limited, and that is often drawn as in a comparative framework with the North Indian Muslim community. So what are the limitations of the existing studies on these Muslim movements? As you can see, most of the studies which I mentioned in the initial phase, whether it is Gilles Kepel, Asaf Bayat, or Niloufar Gold, all those studies have an emphatic ethnographic curiosity on Muslim majority countries, whether it is Turkey, Egypt, or whichever. There is a lack of studies where the Muslims community are in minority. And the limited studies on Muslim movements in India fail to understand the internal dynamics and jurisprudential developments that constitute the Muslim identity and religious discourse. They fail to understand the translation of Islamic law into the local dynamics, and they fail to understand the political assertion of the Muslims in the post-1990s. And that is why they duped these post-1990 Muslim movements either as extremist movements, or they called it as a survival tactic due to the Hindutva majoritarianism. These existing studies especially on the Muslim movements in India, they consider Muslim community as a passive community who are always submissive to the coercive power of the state. So if we can focus more on the hermeneutical and jurisprudential developments within Islam, I think we can have a different way of understanding Muslim movements and the Muslims as thinking agents capable of making meanings. Also, rather than treating fiqh as a given, fixed and universal set of prescriptions that can be then imposed on specific phenomena, a researcher has to analyze what does it do to our understanding of Muslim societies and discourses. So can the understanding of Maqāṣid can be used to understand the Muslim movements itself? That is my very thrust of the aim of my paper itself. Further, the meanings produced through fiqh are not only internal to Muslims, they always refer to something outside. The Muslim community's engagement with the larger majoritarian community, the secular nation state, and the constitution, etc. Just like that, while there is a development within jurisprudence about the classification of Islamic state or land from into Darul Harb, Darul Islam, or Darul Ahad to different kind of two different ways. These kinds of approaches are also can be seen in the engagement of Muslim movements also. So there are some studies which talks about the connection between Muslim movements and Maqāṣid approach. For example, Halim Rene, the Australian scholar, talks about how Maqāṣid approach will help Muslim movements to overcome the existing problems with which they are engaging, and how it can give an Islamic legitimacy while evolving from an ideology-oriented to policy-oriented parties, and thereby responding to the needs and aspiration of broad constituencies. However, Halim Rane considers Maqāṣid approach as something outside the organization, which can be used by the organization. But what I am trying to see is that can there be the Maqāṣid within the organization, or the organization as owning the Islamic law itself? When it comes to India, the fiqh of minorities is more important. I'm not going to the details of the history of fiqh al-aqalliyat, how it has been evolved and all, which we already might know. However, most of the modern scholars who engaged with fiqh al-aqalliyah, they wanted to make a peaceful coexistence, especially of Muslims in the West. So the center focus of fiqh al-aqalliyah by the modern Muslim scholars is Muslims in the West. So the fiqh al-aqalliyah is designed to allow Muslim minorities to honorably subsist and integrate into their new countries while preserving their Islamic identity. Khalid Abu Fadl also talks how the juristic discourse on Muslim minority evolve in their attempt to reconcile the contemporary demands. So as I said, the primary problem with the fiqh al-aqalliyat, the existing fiqh al-aqalliyat, is that they are aimed at reconciling the conflict between Islam and West. If we go through the debates which happened in fiqh al-aqalliyah, even the writings of Qaradawi, or the whole background to the Qaradawi's fiqh al-aqalliyah, there were conferences which happened in France and all. It all mainly focused on how to reconcile the conflict between Islam and West. However, The Muslim community in India is a bit different and is a conundrum actually. There are minorities, but the Muslim communities in India is not numerically irrelevant. They constitute like 200 million population, which is way higher than many other so-called Muslim countries. The other interesting aspect about Muslims in India is that they have a history of ruling the Indian subcontinent for more than 600 years. So then what will be the jurisprudential status of India in the classical division, whether it's a Darul Islam or Darul Harb or the lost land? Due to the same history, there is a reminiscence of culture and heritage of Islam in the Indian geography. In these ways, Muslims community in India is different. And above all, due to the specific case of partition between India and Pakistan, Muslims who are remaining in India are those people who chose to remain in a non-Muslim majority. So these aspects make India a different conundrum. So to understand the Maqāṣid turn and how the Muslim movements are using Fiqhul Aqalliyya, my focus will be on these three scholars. I will be focusing on Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Maulana Maududi, Imam Shatibi. So using the writings of these three scholars, I will try to see how the Maqāṣid turn is happening within these movements. So what are the significance of understanding Maqāṣid for these Muslim movements? The meaning of Islam lies also with the organization. Hence, they can be called as interpretative movements, or in other way, in the Indian case after 90s, Muslim movements becomes the legitimate authority to talk about the law or the objectives of Sharia. In other words, the ijtihad shifts from individual act towards a collective act. Secondly, understanding the dynamics of Islamic jurisprudence will probably help to consciously move away from the existing categorizations. The Muslim movements are already categorized as Salafi, Sufi, Sunni, Islamist in different ways. So trying to understand the Muslim movements through the Maqāṣid might enhance a better theorization of the political articulation of Muslim movements. And at the end, definitely understanding the Maqāṣid turn in the Muslim movements will help to counter the attempts to reduce the new Muslim activism as mere survival mechanism or masquerading. Usually, the mainstream understanding of the shift among Muslim movements is that they are trying to masquerade themselves from the Hindutva majoritarianism, but trying to understand the internal debates of on jurisprudence within these movements, I think we can have a different kinds of approach. And towards the end, this is what I try to think after writing the draft. What does the Maqāṣid turn do to the Muslim sovereignty? Actually, with the with the transformation of Muslim movements, there is an unmaking of community and making of citizens, obedient citizens, a constitutionalized, a secularized citizen, or in other words, minority becomes a self-disciplined category, erasing the questions of Muslim sovereignty. It is also a mechanism through which modern state seeks to characterize itself as a singular personality, thereby erasing the questions of Muslim sovereignty. The transition from Muslims to Muslim minorities is a The transition from Muslims to Muslim minorities is also a question of losing of Muslim sovereignty and Muslim autonomy. I will describe this with a simple example which happened to come across my research. So in 18th century, a group of upper caste Nair warriors decided to demolish a masjid in Malabar, which is a place in South India, to get rid of the curse as per the suggestion of an astrologist. In that time, a group of Muslims, mostly women, went to the local ruler requesting him to not demolish the masjid. These women and the people, they offered him all their wealth. They said, we'll give you all our wealth, jewelry, labor, but do not demolish Allah's masjid. This was their demand. When it comes to the Babri Masjid demolition, which happened in 1992, the language of Muslim movements shifts strategically. Instead of saying Allah's masjid, all the Muslim movements said the demolition of Babri Masjid is the demolition of the domes of secularism. So what's happening when the Allah's masjid is changing to demolition of domes of secularism? Isn't it the loss of Muslim sovereignty that is happening through this Maqāṣid turn within the Muslim movements? So this is largely the idea of the paper. And yeah, thank you. Jazakallah.
Thank you very much. Excellent paper, a lot to think about. We have our commentator, Dr. Basit Iqbal.
Yes, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, thank you. Thank you for this very interesting paper, and to Drs. Uwaimer and Dr. Sharīʿa for inviting me to respond to it, and to IIIT for hosting this very interesting symposium. I've very much appreciated the discussion so far and look forward to the next few days and seeing how the papers develop toward the special issue of Aegis. So this paper begins by noting a new narrative of political Islam in which the discourse of new Muslim movements operates according to the terms set by state constitutions or human rights. And as is well known, this produces a problem for social scientists who struggle to fit modern Muslim movements into the grids of intelligibility that that they deploy between culture versus politics versus religion, public versus private. And the first part of the paper surveys some of these efforts. And so we have terms like post-Islamism, of civil Islam, of Islamist democracy, public Islam, all these terms that people come up with to understand, novel Muslim movements. And many of these approaches, the paper notes, simply fail to reckon with, quote, the internal dynamics and jurisprudential developments of the Muslim minority context in India. And so this is an important argument which promises to locate the political declarations and activities of these new Muslim movements within a different history, one that's not accessible to political science and its key terms of civil society and the state and democracy and populism and so on. It also bears on the theoretical problem of how to understand post-colonial Islam, which has bedeviled scholars for decades, whether insisting on the discursive rupture or continuity of the tradition. I do want to note one part of this introduction, namely the statement that the novelty of these Muslim movements lies in the fact that they articulate their concerns in a secular, I'm quoting, they articulate their concerns in a secular constitutional language or in the universal language of human rights without demeaning their Islamic characteristics. So I'm not interested for the moment in what it would mean to demean something's Islamic characteristics, but to say that their concerns are articulated in a certain language is interesting because Of course, language is not simply a transparent medium of communication. Language has its own structure. It must follow certain grammatical rules to make sense. And this is an argument from Ludwig Wittgenstein and Jalal Asad that that we need to pay attention to the grammar of concepts, how concepts, not just linguistic terms, how concepts are also articulated in relation to each other and to practices within a certain discursive tradition, and in a grammatical formation, so not haphazardly, not arbitrarily. So Asad urges a methodological attention to historical shifts in grammar, which can take place within the same language as well, right? For instance, when the term ijtihad comes to mean something different under different conditions of coloniality or something. So coming to this case, the same claim for an Islamic principle of justice or freedom or welfare, as in the examples from this paper, can be made within different grammatical formations, that is, responding to different imperatives, yielding different results. And so when it comes to modern Muslim political discourse, I would suggest that what's important to pay attention to is less whether their Islamic nature is demeaned or, authentic or inauthentic, but how a certain grammar of concepts shapes the specific claim being made. And this shouldn't be, the now familiar social scientific move of exposing the modernity of a certain religious claim, because these religious claims are also laying claim to a tradition, inheriting and intervening into it. And so that's what I do find promising about this paper, because in order to actually address these internal dynamics, the paper proposes to revisit the Maqāṣidic turn as it shifts kind of beyond the traditional purview of the ulama. And so it proposes to reread the political discourse of new Muslim movements in India as being aligned with the Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa. So here we have the abstraction of certain objectives of the law formed into values and taken up by a political party. So, freedom, justice, security, welfare, and so on. And so here it suggests that the Maqāṣid have traveled beyond the domain of the law in order to become embedded within the political ethics of these organizations. The paper notes that this is a process of adaptation, not adoption. So they're adapting, for instance, the fiqh al-aqalliyat, not simply adopting it. And the paper promises to read the work of 3 historical figures, Shatibi, Maulana Maududi, and Yusuf al-Qaradawi, to demonstrate how such political discourse adapts and further abstracts Islamic principles from the domain of the law. In the version of the paper that I had available, excuse me, I'm just going to close the door. In the version of the paper that I had available, this connection is declared more than demonstrated. So it states that there's a clear correlation and a well-obvious connection between the Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa and this Indian Muslim political discourse. But of course, one might also say that other non-Muslim political parties also align themselves with principles of freedom and welfare and justice. And so the specificity of the correlation still needs to be established. And I'd say also that this paper might fruitfully engage other accounts of modernist Islamists or modernist Islamic political thought, which might be more helpful than drawing on the political scientific or the sociological literature on modern Muslim movements. And so that might give a different set of coordinates rather than the series of terms from the beginning about civil Islam and post-Islamism and so on, which do seem less helpful for the kind of work that this paper is trying to do. The paper finally turns to the significance of understanding Maqāṣid here, and it notes that generally speaking, the Maqāṣidi approach centers the interpretive acuity of the individual jurist, whose penetrating insight is given the role of identifying the particular objectives of the law. Instead, the paper insists on the collective nature of interpretation in general, which always emerges from and responds to an interpretive community. And so when read that way, the new Indian Muslim political movements can be read as collective interpreters of the Sharia. And read that way, we can see these new Muslim movements as engaging, interpreting, and intervening into the tradition of Islamic law as well, specifically through their taking up of the Maqāṣid. So I do find the connection between, the Maqāṣid in the domain of the law and the Maqāṣid in the domain of political ethics, even in this, within the terms of the secular nation state and so on, to be very intriguing. But I look forward, I guess, in the developed paper to seeing how the specificity of that connection is tracked. I'm looking at the time, so I'll skip to the end, but I guess by way of conclusion, I'd invite the author to elaborate a bit on the title of the paper as well, in terms of who owns Islamic law, where by my reading, what the paper is asking is who owns the Maqāṣid in particular. And so it's raising a question of domain. Do they properly belong to Islamic law or to Islamic politics, or how can they travel between them? How do they negotiate how do people negotiate the modern partitions between law and politics in translating between these different domains? The paper did also seem to raise other axes of, speaking of owning Islamic law, other axes of, what we can say is proprietorship, which, for instance, in the question of, is interpretation collective or individual? The question of the Maqāṣid itself as a mode of interpretation that's an operation conducted on the law, which might not itself already belong to the law, as Dr. Kamali's talk yesterday also suggested. But I think I'll leave it there for now and look forward to your comments, and then also the full paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Basit Iqbal. I was negligent. I should have introduced Basit, my very dear friend, and also part of our editorial team at American Journal of Islam and Society. He is also a professor of anthropology at McMaster University in Canada. Just recently started. We're very excited to have him. So thank you, Basit, for this thoughtful commentary. You have 5 minutes to respond. Dr. Clearman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Basit Iqbal, for beautifully making a coherence to my own paper, I would say, which I myself found incoherent at some point of time. In total, I want to say I welcome most of the suggestions, and I have to work on that aspect, especially on these aspects of how Maqāṣid in domains of law and politics is correlated. That's an important take for me, and definitely I will work on that. When it comes to this grammar of concepts, and how the Muslim movements are responding to the different registers of politics. On the one hand, this secular nation state; on the other hand, the Islamic law. So how the grammar of concepts is developing. On the one hand, this specific move is made by Muslim movements through rereading the text. On the other hand, they're sociologically engaging in the real politics. So this is a process through which they are making possible this specific move, through which they are beautifully correlating the text, the law, with the real politics which they are doing, and thereby the domains of law and politics is intertwined. When it comes to your question about the title, who owns Islamic law, yes, as you said, on the one hand, it's a question about the specific part of Islamic laws, just like the laws within politics, laws within religion and all. At the same time, it's also a hypothetical proposition that the Islamic law is not merely owned by the so-called ulamas as such. Rather, movements in the modern time have the potential to own the Islamic law. In other words, the movements themselves become the text which we can read. Rather than reading the text of a specific ulama, the movement themselves are the text which we can read to derive the law. That is what I was hypothetically intending at through the title. Otherwise, I'm so glad that you gave such a comprehensive commentary, and after reading my paper thoroughly, I look forward to developing it. Yeah.
Thank you very much for submitting your paper, and we're really glad to have you as part of our symposium. Professor Dr. Asim Padela, you are next. Please take it away.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you all hear me?
Yes, you can hear you.
And can you see the? Do you see the slideshow, or do you see the other view?
The other view.
Okay, hold on one second. Bismillah, I think this is good. Yeah? Bismillah, Jazakallah khair. I'm very glad to be here with your colleagues, with you all colleagues, to think a little bit about Maqāṣid Shari'a. I thank you, Professor Sharīʿa and Professor Over to giving me the opportunity to share some ideas that some of you know have been older ideas, but we're trying to update them as we move forward. So with that, I will begin to use my 20 minutes to talk a little bit about Maqāṣid models for Islamic medical ethics. And really, the question is a question, but you will note by the end that I have an answer to that question, whether it problem solves or confuses at the bedside. So just as an orientation of who I am, I appreciate the introduction, but I'd like to have a different background than many of the guests today. So I want to share some of that with you. My primary scholarship is at this intersection between Islamic tradition, biomedicine, and Muslim practices. And so I am focused really on thinking about how to empirically study the ways in which religion impacts patient behaviors and decisions. I do some work also around the ethical practices of Muslim physicians, how their religious identity informs the way they're conceived of, or the way they conceive themselves in medicine, but also the ethical challenges that they might face. And do some more conceptual and theological work around the moral guidance that Islam and various sort of intellectual disciplines within the tradition are used and deployed by Muslim scholars when they're thinking about addressing biomedicine. So that's the kind of work I do, bringing to various different disciplines in proceeding. And today in my presentation, you'll see some of that as we move forward. So I'm going to share with you just for brief touch points in the background to Maqāṣid Shari'a, really around the reasons behind this popularity and promise for the area that I'm going to discuss, some foundational concepts in Maqāṣid Shari'a, and particularly in al-Shātibi's model, so that we can talk about the next part of my talk, which will be broadening that framework and applying it to medical ethics. I'll suggest 3 general approaches for that and share with you some scholars who do those things. We'll talk about a test case. So we're actually going to go through a medical ethics case together around how these various approaches will address that case, what the goals of care might be. And then in the end, I want to share a couple of comments, brief comments on the role of Maqāṣid Shari'a in biomedicine. So with that, we know that Maqāṣid Shari'a is a topic of great scholarship, generally speaking, the last 20, 30 years. There are books on this. Here are 2. There are many conferences, predominantly, interestingly, in Malaysia around how to bring forth Maqāṣid Sharia concepts to modern fields. There is an institute, and Jasir Aoud, that I used to be part of to apply T. Perhaps she still is in some way connected, has a Maqāṣid Institute that brings a lot of these global discourses together around Maqāṣid Shari'a. He's a friend, colleague, and a mentor. And we also know that these ideas are then used by some policy stakeholders or policymakers around where they should go forward and create societal structures or policies or even laws, drawing upon some of the concepts that are discussed at these conferences and these books and at these venues. So I think we should think about it as moving from theoretical to practical more specifically over the last 20 years or so. So what are the Maqāṣid Shari'a? This statement here I've quoted from Imam Shafi'i himself, that it is referred to as the Usul al-Din al-Qawaid al-Shari'a wa Kulliyat al-Millah, that this are the fundamentals which in a way cement the legal principles and the claims that a Muslim community makes. But really, in the way that I think about them and what I understand of them, that these Maqāṣid Shari'a, the Maqāṣid are human interests, which are encapsulated within Islamic law. So there's specific interests for humanity that law covers, right? So they ground legal objectives and ethical imperatives. They're termed, obviously, in many writings in the English language as higher objectives, or the overarching intents of Islamic law. But they generate frameworks for more delineating moral norms and ethics. And this is where they're more commonly used today, as opposed to furnishing writ new. We know that in the tradition, you all know, and I won't belabor this, that there's several overlapping constructs within Islamic law that relate to Maqāṣid, including hikmah, illah, and masalih. I won't go into that since it's not particularly important for my presentation today. So now the promises of a Maqāṣid Shari'a. Largely, this is notion by contemporary thinkers about addressing fiqh and the shortcomings of fiqh and bringing it more in alignment with modern science, right? And social science, natural science, you can fill in the blank of what science that is. But this is the idea that between the stagnation, so to speak, or the shortcomings of fiqh, we can bring the Maqāṣid Shari'a to help address contemporary science and society. So what are the arguments that they make? Well, they make that the Maqāṣid Shari'a are broader in scope. They represent the core Islamic axiology of values. They address society, not just individuals, with fiqh being sort of a focus on individual action. Here, Maqāṣid deal with societal structures. The argument also is that it better incorporates science and scientists, right? So that Maqāṣid Shari'a are open to non-scriptural sources of knowledge. They're accessible to human rationality. They remove the source of authority being within legal scholars to other scholars as well, and that they're amenable to interfaith and policy dialogues. So today, Muslim nation states, just heard, but Muslim political groups, we're all thinking about a plural interfaith discourse, right? And so we're allowed to, through the Maqāṣid, project Islamic values onto that plural world, right? Without necessarily being seen as doing that, actually, as seeing as projecting Islamic values, but rather we can share commonalities, yet we are rooted some way within the tradition. And the idea here generally is that they reflect the spirit of the law, right? So addressing fiqh, so now we have not the law itself, not the letter, but the spirit is in the Maqāṣid, but they're close to the mind because they're accessible to human rationality, they're accessible to non-specialists in Islamic law. Therefore, this is championed by many, many contemporary authorities. The Maqāṣid are, generally speaking. So as I mentioned, I want to share a little bit about Shafi'i's theory, just so that we can get into the discussion about the extensions that scholars make. So we all know that the method of discernment that Shafi'i argues is an inductive reading of the Quran and Sunnah, which he then says is qat'i. And he starts off with thinking about the ahkam in the Makki Quran, then there are the specifics, then the many general values, and then he looks at the Sunnah. So he does this sort of inductive work to assert that this is a qat'i way to think about, or to assert that his theory has qat'i elements, right? Just what are those? Some of those are these categories. He argues that the three categories of daruri, haji, and tahsini, essential, necessary, enhancing, this division, these components of the Maqāṣid are qat'i based on his inductive reading. And then he also suggests that there's a hierarchy, with the language itself tells you there's a hierarchy, that the haji supplement the daruri, the necessary supplement the essential objectives, and the tahsini complement the haji. So this is his some aspects of his theory, as I said, will be important in a few slides. In this theory, we all know this. Everybody talks about these 5 essential core maqāṣid, right? Being the hifz, the protection of deen, religion, nafs, human life, nasl, progeny, mal, material wealth, and the intellect, aql. And so there are other extension scholars have made. Some people have other thoughts about nasl and so on and so forth, but this is what al-Shāfi'ī encapsulates. And when he discusses the hierarchy, there is some debate, but it appears to be that he values the preservation of religion over the preservation of life, and then he leaves all the rest as secondary, right? So there's no clear hierarchy amongst those, but religion is over life. And he makes that argument because you're allowed to, in certain cases, it's legal to give up your life for the protection of religion. The secondary objective, so he mentions that he just talks about the essential, the darūrī maqāṣid, and the other maqāṣid can be identified in different ways, which allows this theory to be flexible. They can either be within the scriptural text explicitly stated, or they're inferred. But his model of being a Maliki scholar is to say we can reason about the benefits and harms of actions within society using maslaha mursala, and that would allow us to create new secondary objectives based on context and time and place. All right. So now let's move to the discussion. And I'm not going to talk about the natural rights of man, but rather the moving from this theory to more practical and contemporary discussions on maqāṣid. So as I mentioned, the 3 approaches that I have categorized within thinking about the general extension of maqāṣid, but also how then they are deployed in certain ways to address medical ethics issues. The first approach I called surface level theorization, and this is used to redefine the interests depending on the field that we're discussing. So one of the proponents of this is Dr. Hassan Qassoudeh, and he sort of takes this to the medical. So I'm going to talk about the medical extension. In the paper, I kind of separate these two, but I want to kind of bring it in focus given the time that we have. So his surface level theorization for religion related to medicine becomes that the protection of religion is all about helping people protect the idea they can perform worship and do good works. Life becomes redefined as health, so that's the protection of health. Progeny, protection of procreative capacity. Intellect becomes mental health, and however we define that. And then wealth becomes societal wealth. So this is redefining the interests vis-a-vis thinking about healthcare and what healthcare performs in society. And then in terms of the maqāṣid themselves, he asserts that in medical ethics, for a medical issue to be ethical, it must fulfill or not violate one of the more 5 purposes, meaning the 5 maqāṣid here. And there's a hierarchy, and the hierarchy is read just like that. So religion over life, or progeny, or intellect and wealth. So they're hierarchical principles with that order. And the idea is to supplant or complement the conventional 4-principle model in medical ethics of Beauchamp and Childress, autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So the idea is that replace that with this more Islamicized version of principles. Others have also taken upon this. So one of the scholars who are writing a lot about this is Sheikh Mohammed Saifuddin. He has several papers recently, again from the Malaysian context, and they add a little bit more to that. So they say, okay, well, the evaluative framework using these 5 core maqāṣid should involve evaluation of 3 elements, right? The intention of the act, the nature of the technology or therapeutic, and the outcome produced. So not just the action, but more than that. And if there's a conflict, he adds that we should resort to the qawaid al-fiqhiyya to manage conflicts if one principle is harmed or threatened and the other is advantaged, rather than just a hierarchical relationship that the other scholar said. All right, so the next approach is a conceptual extension, and this really talks about thinking about new maqāṣid. So Professor Jamal and Tariq Ramadan use this approach. So how do you do that? Well, we're going to identify new maqāṣid, thinking about bringing together science and scripture. Tariq Ramadan says natural theology and natural ends needs to be added to not just the scriptural values. And then Jamal talks about divine laws of creation, definitive facts of science really come together to identify new maqāṣid. They also add multiple tiers. So one of the critiques was fiqh deals with individual level. So here we're talking about now and multiple societal levels that the maqāṣid operate under. And Professor Al-Tia also talks about means. So not just the objective, but the wasa'il, the means by which we accomplish them. So let's give you an example of this. So it's a conceptual section. So Preservation of life, nafs, becomes the right to, includes that idea, but incorporates more contemporary ideas about the right to life in law, right? Or the sanctity of body in bioethics. These concepts are now added upon the notion of preserving life. Law talks about human dignity. This is added to the preservation of life. So if these concepts came from somewhere else, they're now going to be part and parcel of what the protection of preservation of life means. Same thing with religion. Preservation of religion becomes now the conception, preserving the conception, Islamic conception of life and death. We'll get into what this means in a second, but it's a little bit ambiguous. That's how he reconceives preservation of religion. And the way this is used in medical ethics issues is then these maqāṣid, as you've newly identified them, they're operating at different levels, lead to moral duties, right? So more of a deontological framework. So this is, for example, from Tariq Ramadan's book, and you see here that he has this idea of global conception of life and death and maslaha. So he moves to, like, before you get to maqāṣid for a field, you have to have these larger concepts of what the Islamic moral theology, the Islamic moral universe would like, and that's really to preserve deen, but deen becomes life and death and maslaha. And as you move forward, you can think about different, or move down, you can think about different values that also have to be incorporated when you define the maqāṣid. Then you can get down to the specific fields, right? Like politics or science. So in any case, he's left it a little bit open. And as you can see, this is ambiguous purposely. He wanted to, when he was the director of Kyle, to bring many groups together to define the specific maqāṣid for each field. The third approach is text-based postulation, where the human interests, right, that the maqāṣid move around, encapsulate, are wedded to Shātibi's text. So that's the text here. Therefore, one needs to postulate, right, the visions of health and flourishing that are embedded and wedded within al-Shātibi's essential objectives. So the idea is that this master jurist had a notion of society, and when he is talking and using this lexicon of life, of deen, of nafs, there's a certain set, a history of values that within that society that he's discussing, not what we might think about today. And then these visions set the minimal end goals of the biomedical enterprise. So this is what becomes an obligation of Islamic law, just that minimal end goal based on that vision. When you bring it to medical ethics, then the deliberation involves using science to add secondary objectives to the primary objectives that he's enumerated and discerning the means to accomplish them. And as I mentioned already, that your fuddle is completed when you reach that minimal goal. Above that becomes something more. Okay, so now we're going to move to using a test case and thinking about these three approaches and how they give us some answers. So the case is going to involve pregnancy and brain death, and this is actually a very live topic, pardon the pun, that is right now in medicine we're talking about. So for example, these are recent papers talking about whether a patient is pregnant and brain dead should receive life support. In this case, the question is about life support to maintain gestation, but over the objection of an appointed surrogate. And you can see here that a brain dead pregnant woman, right, who was quite young, was kept alive for almost a third of a year to deliver a child via C-section. So these are things that we talk about presently in medical ethics discussions. So our case is a 19 weeks old, a pregnant female who's declared brain dead, who's at 19 weeks gestation. And just as a rule of thumb, since some of you might know the statistics, if you think about fetal viability, meaning will the child who is birthed leave the hospital alive, at 23 weeks of gestation, about a quarter of them will, depending if you have a conventional hospital system, right? So a developed nation here, half at 24 weeks, about 75% at 25 weeks. This is just a rule of thumb. It varies by state and hospital system, but that's the idea here. So 19 weeks, you have almost nil fetal viability. And we know from the Islamic tradition, depending on how you want to, which scriptural texts you want to interrogate in the hermeneutical theory, ensoulment occurs at 40 or 120 days of fetal age. So that's the context of the case. The ethical question that I'm going to just here in the talk, and I have some more in the paper, are what are the appropriate goals of care based on these three approaches to medical ethics using the Maqāṣid. So approach one, as I mentioned, is service level theorization, which becomes principalism. And the illicit act must preserve all the five Maqāṣid, which some argue, or privilege the higher ones, right? If there's conflict. So from the mother's perspective, preserving worship in this case, right, is not possible. A brain death individual is not, the notion of brain death is that prognostically, using the maximal technology we have today, that person will not regain consciousness. It's a prognostic entity. And here, therefore, there will be no ability to preserve that worship. In terms of preserving life, that depends on what you think brain death means, right? If it's a living state, if it's a dead state, or it's a dying state. So if it's a living state, then perhaps you can preserve life there. If you think it's a dead state, then you obviously cannot. The preservation of procreative capacity is possible by maintaining life support, right? At least to fetal viability. Therefore, that would be another child potentially to add. So you've preserved procreative capacity. And in terms of preserving societal wealth, well, we know that costs of ICU care are exorbitant. And so that will be disadvantaged, but it'll be advantaged by the removal of life support. So you see in the hierarchy, we have this notion of procreative capacity being privileged over societal wealth. If you add the fetus standpoint, all objectives here, save societal wealth, are advantaged, right? If the child is maintained to the point of fetal viability and can be birthed alive. So therefore, from this model, would be the maintenance of life support is the end goal, because higher order is preserved here, at least procreative capacity over societal wealth. Or if you think preserving life is possible because the person is living, or the patient is living, then that is even advantaged. The second approach is conceptual extension. So here we redefine the end goals, right, and we set new duties. So the idea is to incorporate science and society and adding these specific domain objectives, Maqāṣid. And there is a notion that the objectives are a unit taken together, but they do have levels, as both Professor al-Sharīʿa and Professor Jamal talk about. So let's look at Jamal al-Sharīʿa's model. So from the mother's perspective, again here, preservation of human life is actually, so he says life over religion, not like how Shāfi'ī says religion over life. So preservation of human life is the most important, paramount objective, and includes the notion of bodily sanctity. And within that objective, there's some tension, right? Because you can certainly preserve human life if you believe the brain-dead pregnant woman is alive. But to do so, you would have to disrupt bodily sanctity, right? A patient who is declared brain dead requires a lot of support and a lot of interventions, including catheters, blood pressure support, a ventilator to breathe. So you're going to be disrupting that bodily sanctity to provide that support. Preservation of mind, piety, and honor, that's his construction of those maqāṣid are not applicable, but wealth here, again, will be disadvantaged by continuing, but advantaged by removing life support. From the fetus standpoint, again, the same sort of scenario. Preservation requires perpetrating harms, right, or disrupting the bodily sanctity of the mother, or you can say even instrumentalizing this human body, whether you believe it's dead or alive. So that's how you proceed, or that's what you have to think about. So here the end goal is not necessarily clear, since the highest objective is preservation of human life. It has multiple components, and there is some tension between them. But caution might suggest you have to maintain the life on life support. And what's interesting here is, though this model, and I'll get back to this further in the future in a few slides, the idea is that social and natural science will be better incorporated by this model. Well, you don't get any additional guidance, right? Brain death is not simply a physiological entity. It's a construct in society, right? It means certain things. It has certain criteria. And neither science will tell you what that means. Science will certainly won't tell you what that means, and neither will scripts. So we'll move forward and talking about that perhaps in the Q&A. And Tariq al-Man's model, we're stuck. Global conception, preserving the global conception of life and death is left unclear. We don't know whether this patient is dead or alive. And so you stop there, you're not able to go forward in his analysis. So in terms of the third approach, which is text-based postulation. So again, you have to explicate the moral vision related to al-Shāfi'ī's model, which sets the moral obligation to actualize. The hierarchy amongst the maqāṣid is maintained. So from the mother's perspective here now, preservation of nafs, and preservation of nafs, if you read his text, this is the minimal obligation, right? The person should be nourished so they don't starve, should be clothed so they're not naked, should have procreative capacity, because without procreative capacity, humankind will no longer be able to sustain itself, and you should be protected from calamities that will strike you like an earthquake, otherwise you die. That is the conceptualization of the minimally of protection of preservation of nafs. That's the minimal idea. Then biomedical science or social science will tell you how to achieve this, but that's the minimum obligation that Islamic law has for preserving life. From the fetus standpoint, again, the same idea that all the objectives are predicated on maintaining the mother's life with maximum support, if you believe she's living. So, yeah, this is the wrong statement here, but again, here, I apologize for that. The idea is, again, that you might be able to argue for preserving the mother or maintenance life support. So moving to some more of an analysis here of critical shortcomings, well, all approaches, these three, suggest that the moral vision is to maintain life support on the pregnant, brain-dead mother, and that there are moral duties to do so, that we should either minimal or maximal duties to continue that. But practically, none of them, right, mention limits to the objective. This because in most of the constructions, preservation of life is perhaps second or the dominant, the overarching highest objective. There's no mention of limits, right, to this human action. So what does that mean at all times? So fiscal concerns, because they talk about material wealth or societal wealth, are secondary. But what's interesting here is that the legal status is non-persons. Neither the fetus nor the mother would be considered to be a person. Right? This is not engaged with. Right? You might think they have some value, but what does that mean? The fetus is not, not yet. If you're taking the 120, it is not yet sold fully. There's some relationship and contingency. The mother is declared brain dead, and jurisdictionalized, that's death. And I'll get to in a second. Muslim legal scholars have discussed that as a state where akin to legal death. A theological concern, so the argument is that Maqāṣid or al-Sharīʿa, and when you do an ethical framework you draw an ethical framework based on it, reflects the spirit of the law. Well, my concern here is that what is the spirit of the law here? Is the mother's life less valuable? We're asking to maintain that, but can we think about there being a less valuable because the preservation of religion or worship is not possible? What theological response do we get from using the Maqāṣid in this sort of way? How is the spirit of the law incorporated into this deliberation model? The fiqhi tensions, so as I mentioned here, there's a near consensus view, and we can discuss this further in the Q&A or discussion, that life support can be withdrawn when certainty of recovery is not possible. Certainty is one notion, or when brain death is declared. The modern and contemporary juridical councils, as well as the classical jurists, don't consider medical care to be obligatory except for certain conditions. One of those is certainty of recovery. And then modern councils allow for brain death to be legal death. So this fiqhi notion is not at all reflected in the Maqāṣid medical frameworks that we're talking about, which would demand us maintaining life support upon the mother with no constraint. The other idea here, these concepts which are found replete within medical ethics discussions by fuqaha about hurma and karama, inviolability and sanctity of the body, these give pause to interventions, right? They push back against this instrumental usage of the human body. Again, the Maqāṣid models here would suggest that's fine. Methodologically, I'll say that surface level theorization can fall prey to relativism. So if you redefine the human interests for each field differently, so we have now defined aql as mental health because we're in a healthcare context, and if we're defining aql as ahliya, for some other concern, then we're falling prey to not just relativism within the different fields that we're applying Maqāṣid deliberation to, but also across time and space. What does this notion of mental health mean today in the United States versus a pagan society in the middle of Africa? It means something different. So the interests become relativistic and don't give us some real grounding when we're thinking about forecasting forward the Islamic moral vision using the Maqāṣid. The conceptual extension approach, as I already indicated here, my concern is that though the argument is that we can incorporate science, do these really incorporate science or not, right? Social scientists tell us, we have scores of studies that would tell us that there are harms of loved ones being in the ICU. There's certain psychological stress upon the family, not just cost. There are people who get PTSD, there's further family dynamic issues. So social science tells us of these harms, right, which the Sharia would acknowledge, but they're not incorporated within this model. Right? How do we think about harms? Empirical science, as I just said, does not tell us whether a brain dead state is living or dying, right? Death is a construct in a sense. Yes, it has an ontological notion. I'm just saying that within the context of brain death, there is a construct in society. No answer. And then putting scripture and science on the same level really leads to questions about what's normative, particularly when you're claiming Islamic XYZ, right? From Wahi, Islamic XYZ, what's normative here? And then the third model, the sort of it has a challenge of being historic, right? So you're wedded to the dated social and techno-scientific imaginaries, which Shaltabi had incorporated somewhat explicitly, somewhat subtly within his writings. So now how you deal with that, with the fact that medicine and healthcare in that time is very different than it looks like today, right? Society was very different, right, than it looks like today. How would you move forward and incorporate a more, well, not say incorporate, but just address the contemporary realities around these concepts? So my final thoughts here, I think that Maqāṣid frameworks, right, have their place, but they can't suffice us for a holistic critique of modern medicine. When you think about the Maqāṣid being bandied about in economics, as you heard, in political science and social science and other areas, and policy making, the idea is that we're going to rectify a problem that's occurring in society where Islam is not present or Islamic values are not there. I think if you want to apply it to modern medicine, you can't start with just Maqāṣid and medical ethics deliberation, right? Ethical questions arise in the context of a social structure. There are certain expectations that society sets up for what medicine should provide. And there's a history of ideas behind that, right? So brain death is acceptable because if you think about the human as a rational actor and rationality is lost and that human person is no longer a person, therefore the body, even though it might suffice, it's not considered to be housing that human person, therefore the person can be dead, right? There's a lineage and a logic of how these ideas become used to argue for certain entities like brain death. And just infusing Maqāṣid at medical ethics level will not, or whatever construction Maqāṣid you have, will not address that social structure, nor the history of ideas that have led to the question that we're being faced with. So I don't want to leave it all as negative. I think positive-wise, do think in the growing field of Islamic bioethics, we can think about Maqāṣid having a place. So if you think about the three fonts of morality, you can address morality through agent-based models, act-based models, and end goal-based models. And I think that Maqāṣid frameworks could help us think about, the end goal in a complementary fashion, where fiqh might help us think about the moral status of the act, and then virtue-based theories, as you just heard, a little bit of adab can help us think about the agents, all right? And then, so therefore you put all these three things together and then furnish a deliberative model for medical ethics based on all three of them, not just privileging one or the other. That's a big project. Inshallah, there'll be people who are able to do that. And I will end there, hopefully on time, so we can have some conversation.
Thank you very much, Asim, Padela, for the really rich presentation. The commentator is my co-editor at American Journal of Islamic Society and professor at Lancaster University in political philosophy and religion, and a distinguished scholar of Quranic studies, Dr. Sharīʿa. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. Dr. Padela, thank you for your paper. I really enjoyed it. It's fascinating, and I'm glad that I listened also to the final part very attentively, because I think it brought out all the points that, or it preempts all the points that I wanted to share with you, or most of them anyway. But let me summarize here some of the ways I think the paper could push the critique beyond where it stands now. So I'm speaking more about the written paper that you have shared with us. I think in putting forward a schema for understanding the different approaches to bioethics based on Maqāṣid, you have helped us see the limits and constraints, the internal limits and constraints, which become clear through your case study. But all these approaches assume the failure of fiqh or the failure of the traditional approach. And I wonder whether your final part on fiqh and where the limitations are in the specific case of brain death is not enough, because the assumption that fiqh fails needs to be not just critiqued, but it needs to be set out very clearly in relation to the case study, but also in relation to these approaches. So perhaps that could be clarified in the paper further. There's also a possibility, maybe not for this paper, perhaps indicated toward the end, where, as you did in the presentation, where could the fiqh approach help? How could it be expanded in order to address the shortcomings of the current Maqāṣidi approaches? The other point that I would like to raise is about the hermeneutic approach of al-Sharīʿa. It is clear, based on the discussions since yesterday, that there is a kind of methodological ambiguity in the Maqāṣidi approach. That methodological ambiguity, in my view, and I'm happy to engage in a conversation about that, arises from the fact that much of the Maqāṣidi discourse leaps over al-Shātibi's own hermeneutic approach. So there's hardly any engagement with the inductive reading that al-Shātibi applies to the Quran and Sunnah in order to arrive at his Maqāṣid. The Maqāṣid are plucked out, divested of the broader system of that he presents, as you put it forward, in relation to usul and al-Qawa'id and the ru'ya kulliya, or the comprehensive vision or holistic vision of religion. So this plucking out leads to the decontextualization of Maqāṣid. So perhaps something in that direction, in relation to explaining why there is this hermeneutic ambiguity and why have the Maqāṣid lend themselves in the three models to being applied in different ways and expanded in different ways, even within the text-based approach. It's because of that lack of clarity. So, al-Shātibi puts a great emphasis on the Arabic language and puts a great emphasis on historically contextualizing the Quran. So he wants asbab al-nuzul as part of the hermeneutic approach. He wants the language of the Arabs to be central to the hermeneutic approach. All this is hardly ever engaged, and it leaves us unsure about how the Maqāṣid are being applied, or how the new Maqāṣid, even in the expansive model you've presented, the second approach is based in the text. A third point is about let's say the really productive conclusion you've presented about how these fields of knowledge, for example, in relation to mental health care, and I've read a little bit about mental health care in the context of medical anthropology, and it was very clear that mental illness is a construct and it's culturally specific. Not just mental illness, but various aspects of health are the product of modern science with its own normativities with different teleologies that arise out of modernity, that might be, when we apply a Maqāṣidi approach that uncritically and unquestioningly accepts the norms and approaches of science, especially medical science, but also social scientific, as you mentioned, research on the emotional impact of a certain condition on the relatives of a patient. All of this arises out of an epistemology that is materialist, that is realist, that has a different kind of, let's say, normative undergirding. And a Maqāṣidi approach, it would be really counterintuitive to apply a Maqāṣidi approach in this piecemeal, instrumental way. A Maqāṣidi approach is, in my understanding, a holistic approach that tries to understand the spirit of the law, but then if you apply it in piecemeal fashion to specific cases without really understanding the norms of the field of knowledge you're applying the maqāṣid in, you've actually done something counterproductive, counterintuitive, and that undermines the logic behind the maqāṣid itself. So these are three points, and the final one is about when we think of healthcare in, let's say, in modern Muslim context or in the broader global context, healthcare and conceptions of health and the study of medicine are all part of a capitalist system that is that is institutionalizing ways of being. So there are these, broader ontological questions that need to be asked, and also a kind of critique that takes into account the, let's say, the economic dimension of healthcare, especially within, in the context of COVID today. It's become so clear who has access to vaccinations and who doesn't, and individual decisions here applying a maqāṣidi approach, even at state level, cannot address the broader global ethical issues. So to what extent can we just implant some kind of Islamic approach that, in the context, in the different levels of context that I've talked about, that in a way absolves the Muslim physician or the Muslim practitioner from feeling that they are acting outside Islam and Islamizing for them, or offering them processes for making decisions that seem compatible with Islam, whereas the whole structure, whether at institutional level, let's say the economic, global economic level, the cultural level of modernity, there are tensions at all these levels that the maqāṣidi approach have sort of turned a blind eye to in some of the work. I'm not saying all of the work. So these are frontiers of the critique that I would hope that maybe in the conclusion could be pushed further. I think that would be really helpful and would offer the broader context as well. Yesterday we mentioned the question of power, questions about modernity, contextualizing science and modernity. Maybe that would be perhaps expanding the paper beyond its current focus, but maybe indicating that these are important directions in critiquing how bioethics are being serviced by the maqāṣidi discourse. I hope that has been helpful, and thank you very much.
Barakallahu feekum. Jazakallah khair. No, I really appreciate the comments and points here. I agree largely with you, so I don't have much to respond. I'll say a few things here. But the first thing I'll say is that this is part of a book project IOIIT for 4 years. So some of the things that you're talking about are in other chapters of the book. Inshallah, I know that I hope, inshallah, to be able to finish that, but I'll furnish some of those conceptual lines within the chapter as I end it in the conclusion. A few things that I want to comment on what you mentioned. The idea that fiqh fails. So, one of the things I'm speaking on medical ethics, not bioethics generally, because I try to differentiate medical ethics at the bedside level, bioethics at societal level, right? That's how a bioethics thinks about. So I wanted to show the problems at the bedside level. And then there's another bit I have on health policy, which is a science level, where there's also issues with Maqāṣid working at that framework. But let's take the notion of fiqh fails. So today, if you read Islamic medical ethics or even Islamic bioethics fatwa, there are only two constructs that are used to either, right? It's a reactionary largely approach. And if it's transformative, it's very transformative in a very rudimentary way. And you have either darura, make something permissible, or maslahat, make it permissible. That's it. Like so fiqh, I agree that the fiqh hasn't failed as much, but fiqh has failed in a certain way, because the only armamentarium juridical scholars bring forth, or dominantly, is this notion of we're going to permit it, right? So reactionary wise, it's darura, we have to do it, right? even if there's fetal cell lines within some vaccine and COVID-19, oh, life is preserved. Maqāṣid there, that's the darura khalas. Or we say maslaha, look, this idea of organ transplantation is going to help save lives again. That's the only thing we talk about, saving lives, right? And then therefore it's maslaha, so we're going to permit it. I'm overgeneralizing and simplifying, but for me to give response to fiqh hasn't failed. Yeah, fiqh hasn't failed, but it has failed. As a practical physician and thinking about these things, that has failed because all we get are these two concepts, which have, only going towards not doing what we just said, the last part, holistic critiques of modern medicine writ large, right? The contemporary, all you've done is permit it either in a sort of a underhanded way or an overhanded way. It doesn't matter. You've permitted it and therefore go forth mashing. And so I have a little bit of a challenge of thinking about what you just said, about how to think about fiqh hasn't failed. It hasn't failed, but it has failed. And those two concepts, darura and masla, are part and parcel of the Maqāṣid conversation. So it becomes a sort of teasing out where we're thinking about that. So that's my first, to your first point and the last point. And then social construction of disease, which is, I was trying to foreshadow that perhaps if that there is some social construction that we need to do, or we need to recognize, both at a fiqh level and a maqāṣid level, and that what you're saying, we'll just rubber stamp using maqāṣid and then counter to what the idea would have been, by just saying, okay, well, look, this preserves life or this preserves mental health, and therefore we don't check the concept of mental health. It just becomes preservation of that, and we're done. And so I actually think it'll be a real problem because you'll remove jurists and any hermeneutical theory and any sort of scriptural basis, and now you have people like me who know very little start using it blasé, right, to say that we're now doing medical ethics decision making based on the spirit of Islamic law. And the spirit of Islamic law is not a spirit; it's just a specter of, it's a wisp, right? It's a mist. It's not. There's no spirit there. So I agree with the critiques. I really appreciate it. And inshallah, after when we get to revise, I'll be in conversation with you to tease some more ideas out so I can buttress the last part of the paper, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakallah khair.
All right, thank you very much for this exchange. It's been really productive. Now I'll open up the floor to everyone among the attendees and other presenters to ask questions of each other. Please raise your hand. And if there are too many hands, just write your question in the comment, or merely write in the comment that you have a question so I can go in order. Please go ahead. Are there any questions that I'm not seeing? Okay, right now there are no questions written either. All right, so I guess let me start by asking, perhaps Dr. Padela, I'll ask you to reflect on, so I think that your final comments were very interesting. That fiqh has also become effectively utilitarian and effectively a branch of maqāṣid. In other words, it's between maqāṣid and maqāṣid. And is that merely, often when we think about maqāṣid, we tend to think of a few, a particular strand of scholars and activists who are using maqāṣid, but from your description and the complexity of the issues involved, it may seem that you really have to conceptualize this as a problem between different kinds of specialists. So it's really between ulama and modern specialists. And if we could reconceptualize the problem not as merely the use of different themes or different types of fiqh or different, or reform versus conservatism. What we are really talking about is different kinds of elite that are making these decisions. And I might go as far to say there is a power struggle between two bodies of knowledge. And if we think about it this way, does that shed light on some of the challenges that you're facing with? And before you answer that, I want to ask a question of each of the presenters and then let you go. Sahil, Jamal, Kiliamano, I want to ask a similar question of you, which is, ulama do not appear in your account, right? It seems that the Maqāṣid in your account is a solution to the problem presented by perhaps both the old style Islamists and perhaps the conservative ulama, who would emphasize Islamic identity or Islamic norms more. In your account, Maqāṣid seem to find a way to secularize Islamic discourse without acknowledging that that's what's happening. But is that how you see it? Do you think that to what extent does Maqāṣid operationalize Islam versus write Islam out of the discourse? Which one would you think that is? And relatedly, what is happening to the ulama, which didn't appear as much in your account? And even the Maqāṣid appeared very briefly in your, and I have to say that I haven't read your papers carefully. I listened to your discussion, so maybe you talk more about it there. And I guess I asked enough questions of Dr. Sami al-Daghistani, so I'm going to perhaps ask him to reflect on the other two presentations at the end if he sees fit. But I'm asking these questions because I didn't see any questions. I think there is one right now. So after you answer these questions, we'll go to Yusuf Sufi.
Sure. So I appreciate the kind of the analytic or the term that you're applying now, Professor Anjum. So I think that what has happened, and people, I agree, there's not a lot of social scientific or anthropological work here, but I do think that the ulama, or also the fuqaha here, are not, they're lost, right, in the sense of authority structures are being changed, and particularly in this area, like so economics is one, medicine is another, where the vocabulary, the social, all of it is a little bit bewildering. So for them, just like in the olden times, how did Imam Abu Hanifa, there was this notion that the polity said, oh, this is a master jurist, master scholar. So how do we get someone to be a master jurist, master scholar? You'll find, okay, well, I'm going to just use this notion of Maqāṣid, someone will understand, the polity will understand, and therefore go ahead. So they're, interestingly, although you might have a Hanafi scholar who has a skepticism towards maslaha and Maqāṣid, they'll put that within their little writing, right? And Hanafi jurists write very little in their fatwa, but it'll be there somewhere, and it also accords with Maqāṣid of preserving life without any real in-depth notion what that looks like, because they want to maintain that space of, okay, the laity will understand what I'm saying, and I've given some notion that I do understand the modern notion of Maqāṣid, right? Which all these elites, the ulama, I'll say, the ulama al-waqi', right, are banning about. So I think it's I'm not gonna say it's a language game, but it's a power struggle that I think people don't recognize, that it is what's happening. That although they will say it's not part of my usul al-fiqh notion, I'm gonna incorporate this in my public fatwa, not my private ones, public fatwa, so people can see that I still am understanding what's going on in that field. I still have it. I'm being more flexible in my approaches, and then I can get traction within both the scientific community and the laity. But if you analyze it in terms of depth, it's not there. right? Fatwas on smoking being another example of people. Okay, well, yeah, it's preservation of life. What do you mean? It's not, it was never it was never haram. It was right, makruh, but that's all lost. It becomes just mubah plus and move forward. So I think it's a great point. I think that would be great commentary within this volume that someone talks about this power and authority struggle, where it's Maqāṣid. And what I'll say is it's not actually much knowledge. So you said communism, it's not much. I just think it's a simple sort of political move, rather than I'm going to really invest my time in thinking about how Maqāṣid are going to reimagine the way I think about usul al-fiqh and how I do my fatwa. Make it simply a statement on a piece of paper to allow people for them to say, I still have maintained some sense of the modern authority. As far as the elites, I think the elites have, the other issue is that the elites have the knowledge. They have the knowledge of the science, they have the knowledge of the society. And so, unfortunately for them, Maqāṣid allows them to maintain legitimacy what they don't have legitimacy within the scripts. And so now when I say Maqāṣid, oh, this person knows, right? The lay person saying this person knows Islamic law. They're using this really big term, Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa. They must have studied, they must understand. And therefore allows them a space without doing any of the baggage, any of the work, any of the hard work of going through the confusing and confounding nature of fiqh rulings. So I think that's a power struggle that's continuous. And it's unfortunate that even the juridical councils in Islamic bioethics system, we talk about Islamic juridical councils, the language there is they use Maqāṣid, they say this or that. And so you find out that, the really important topic is dealt out with a very rudimentary response. And so the new fiqh that's occurring, I don't know where it's occurring, because I can't analyze anything beyond this rote notion of Maqāṣid. So hopefully that answers some of it, but I think you've picked up something really important that's happening within the notion of Islamic law, generally speaking, in the contemporary age.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Awamir, for that, even that questions. Definitely, it's true that ulama doesn't appear as such in my paper. Maybe the way I structured my paper also had to do that, had to do with that absence. Yeah, I think even as Basit Iqbal also mentioned, maybe I have to trace Islamic political thought rather than focusing on modern political scientists. That way, I think the structuring my paper that way might help better to analyze the role of ulama and how the ulama gradually shifts into these movements. And I'm not trying to say that Maqāṣid is a solution to the problem. That is not what I intend, but rather I'm trying to analyze how the Muslim movements are using Maqāṣid for operationalizing Islam. There was actually a deadlock in the 1990s, especially after the majoritarian influx, the Hindutva majoritarian influx in the 1990s, which was visible with the demolition of Babari Masjid in 1992. There was actually a deadlock for Muslim political articulations. How to move further within the Indian political sphere was a question in front of Muslim movements. I think in that specific context, the Maqāṣid approach actually helped Muslim movements to move further through operationalizing Islam itself. I think that is how I perceive that things.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sami, please go ahead. We'll take your comment first.
Yeah, thank you. I just have a general comment and then a question for Dr. Padela. A general comment is that, and this is, it moves on from some of the discussions that we have had thus far. In my understanding is that, and in my opinion and research that I've done on Islamic economics, that contemporary Islamic economics, I think, failed on so many levels, not only methodologically, but also epistemologically, right? And therefore, there's a sort of a hype of how to use, and this is one part of the discussion, how to use the Maqāṣid or Maslaha discourse in economics, in finance, in banking, right? What I try to do in this paper instead is really to examine the epistemology of the classical scholarship, that it's not only found in fiqh works, right, on economics, whereby I would argue there was part of a broader and larger discussion on earning and provision, right, which conveys a message that economics, it's not a science on its own, but it has to be part of basic human behavior. So I see economics really at the end of the day as a human science, right? And this is something that Al-Ghazali talks about it, but also many other scholars. So that's just a general comment that I think really ties into the whole discussion of the role and the need of Maqāṣid in the contemporary era. Now, my question is for Dr. Padela. It's on brain dead, but also more on the status of fetus and when really the soul kind of, when is the soul breathed into the fetus? Because I remember some of the discussions I had with my former advisor, Mohammed Ghali, whom I also noticed you've referenced in your work. And I'm just wondering, when does exactly life start? If there's any kind of clearer indication as to when this happened, according to either classical scholarship or modern interpretations, because I think this would maybe help provide answers to that. Also ties into the very notion of masalih and maqasid and other concepts that we're dealing with currently. Thank you.
All right. So the first thing I'll say, I want us to think about as a group the first thing that you mentioned, and this is something I remember discussing with Talal al-Aldim at Oxford Center of Islamic Studies when he was. So he had a very early version of something I presented to him at OSIS many years ago, and he was talking about the entire sum, right? So he does a history of Islamic law, all of Islamic law, every concept, every construct, every tool was embedded with a social notion that, so it might show up in darura or whatever, you want to pick one, maslaha, but actually all of it, the whole thing. And so what has happened, and so now I'm paraphrasing him, is that everybody tries to take, like what Dr. Shuk said, the peaceful notion, without interrogating what the society looked like. So when you take Maqāṣid, what was society supposed to be like? What does the lawgiver want society to look like? Is it supposed to be a capitalistic economy? Is it supposed to be agrarian? Is it supposed to be only suffice yourself? You take some hadith and say only eat today, don't save anything for tomorrow, right? What is it supposed to look like? We don't know what it's supposed to look like, and so we haven't figured out or thought deeply enough about what it's supposed to look like. So then we just bandy about different arguments with no conclusion. And I think the same. So I don't know Islamic economics as well as you do, but I think when we say Maqāṣid, I cringe and I say, okay, well, do we actually know what the lawgiver wanted society to look like? Because when you use fiqh, you're saying I just want to fit things. I want to fit that you're not sinful today. I want to fit whatever Islamic law says so that today you're not committing an act that's sinful. But when you say Maqāṣid, then I'm saying, what's the vision? What is it supposed to look like at the end? If you can't tell me that, then I don't need fiqh. Nothing can get me there. You have to do the work, meaning the theorist. And that's my concern. Like, it's just an overarching concern, and his concern that we don't know the maqsad. We don't know where we're supposed to go. And nothing will tell us today where we're supposed to go. It has to either go back to revelation or not. Right? That's it. And so as I said, I want all of us to think about this, because I struggle. I'm struggling, and I think this group will perhaps help us understand that better. As to now answering the more medical ethics, bioethics sort of things, and my salam to Ghali and I are good friends. We know each other for a long time. So in terms of, we don't have an answer. The nusus are not clear about, or the interpretation of the nusus is not clear about what we think about when this moment occurs. I think that you could make an argument. People have as you all know, the dominant position is 120 days based on a certain hadith. Other people say it's 40 days based on another hadith, and the madahib are different on that. In the Hanafi fiqh, for example, we talk about istibanat al-khalq. We talk about the human form, not just the soul. So it was interesting, and there's I have a chapter co-authored with Dr. Muhammad Sudalski that just came out last week on abortion and the Hanafi law, where we talk about there's two ways. Some people take the hadith to mean metaphysical occurrence of soul. And so they say 120 days because we don't understand how the soul interacts. Others say, no, it has to be acquired by scientific view, that the human looks like a human form, a surah. And then they have, even the Hanafi fiqh, they have a different view of when the hurma applies, right, of abortion, based on, we knew that the human form looks at certain 13 weeks. I mean, you can see at 9 weeks that the human looks like a human. So in any case, you can read what you want within one school there, but there's some clarity. And so the idea that we're going to figure, no, there are different scholarly positions that have different grounding that based on certain notions of whether metaphysics relates to the physical or not, and interpretation of the hadith itself. When we say a human life, I think then you have to bring in theological and social scientific understandings. When we say when the fiqh is applied to whether this requires compensation, it's the fiqh. But what we adjudicate human life, so a fetus born without a brain, anesthetic human being, is it a human being? That concept, is it a human being? We can say, well, you should bury it, it doesn't cry, don't bury it, don't do janazah. Okay, is it a human being? Is fiqh going to tell us that? I don't know. Will Maqāṣid tell us that? I don't know. And I think that's where we have fallen short in my reading on all of it, in the intellectual tradition, that we have in mind sufficiently enough to think about what human life looks like today, because we didn't have that idea in the past necessarily. And the end of life, the same thing. Brain death, I use it all. This to me, I don't know, many years ago, I became so interested because it brings it all out, right? Is the human person there or not? You want to talk human person? Does nafs mean the Quran? Person doesn't mean ruh. What does it mean? And is a brain dead person? Because we know scientifically the brain hasn't stopped functioning when you say brain death. Parts of the brain still work. Who decides what parts of the brain? Like, is the hypothalamus part of the brain? Some would argue no, but physiologists say yes. Biologists say yes. Then it still functions. You maintain your body regulation of temperature. Therefore, it's part of the brain. Therefore, it can be, brain death is not total brain failure. But we have a notion that no, that's not significant. It's not vital. It's not important. And the scholars, the fuqaha, have just done that. All vital functions of the brain have ceased. Who's decided what the vital functions are? Not you, not your scripts. Some clinical guidelines somewhere based on some sort of notion of what the human being is, or the biology of the brain is. So it's an uncritical appraisal of that term. So I can't tell you that either, which is why I say, is the human person there or not? I don't know. Right? Science won't tell you that, because we might get a scanner tomorrow. I'm going to stop in a second. I see you again, uneasy there, Professor Anjum. But science today, right, can tell you that there might be function in the brain. Science 20 years from now might say there's function in the brain. I mean, science might tell you there's no function in the brain based on criteria. Science in the 20 years from now might say, oh, actually, that person who thought they were dead actually had function in the brain because we have a better scanner today. Right? I say someone's dead because they have no heartbeat. I listen with my ears. No, I listen with a stethoscope. Oh, forget about stethoscope. I can look with an ultrasound. Does that mean that whole thing changed? And that's the problem, that we haven't decided fully or understood fully or explicated fully from our tradition what even human life means, even human person fully, even human dignity for the modern age. So we're stuck.
Thank you for that.
Yusuf Sufi, please go ahead.
Okay, I've got a comment and question for both Asim and Tahir. Asim, thank you for your paper. My comment is similar to Dr. Naguib's in that I'm wondering if you're a little bit uncharitable towards the Maqāṣid thinkers. You point out that there's ambiguity in the Maqāṣid models, but could it be otherwise? When we look at any principle, there's always a need to flesh out how a principle is to be applied. Wouldn't it be better to examine a case study in medicine where a Maqāṣid thinker elaborates in ways that countenance your claims about ambiguity and see if they do a good job or not? The other thing, Asim, is that as I heard you answer the questions of other panelists, I couldn't help but wonder if, with all the intricacies of medicine and considering the general nature of the Islamic principles that are championed when we look at these questions of bioethics, questions about the value of life, which are pretty rife throughout the globe. I wondered if there's even why you think there's even a need for the Islamic tradition, legal tradition, Maqāṣid or otherwise, to play a role there. I'm not saying that as an actual critique. I just would like to hear what you have to say about it. Tahir, my question for you relates to Basid's point about you needing to substantiate the use of Maqāṣid among South Indian movements. You mentioned an academic conference where Maqāṣid was part of the topics discussed. Do you have access to those conference lectures? And if so, are you able to center that in your paper? I think that would solve the issue of making the link between Maqāṣid and these movements. Alternatively, you might want to think about how these movements take inspiration from Maqāṣid, but also move beyond it, because notions of justice, for instance, while not alien to the Maqāṣid, aren't the 5 or 6 traditional Maqāṣids that the scholars we've been talking about today posit. So those are my questions, comments for both of you.
Do you want to go first? I've taken the first time. You want to go first? Go ahead.
Oh, okay, it's fine with me. So yes, I do have access to those materials, the lectures which happened in that conference. The other ones which I will be referring to for understanding this thing is some of the magazines which are run by these movements. So these magazines run by these movements have articles on Maqāṣid, and especially a lot of translations from Yusuf al-Qaradawi that's been happening. This is happening since Yusuf al-Qaradawi's fatwas are being translated to Malayalam language by Islamic Publishing House, which is a publishing house in Malayalam language. So I'll be looking at these materials. There are particularly 2 magazines. One is Prabodhanam journal and another is Bodhanam. These 2 journals and the book, there is recently a book came out from Islamic Publishing House on Maqāṣid Sharia itself. So these will be the materials which I can substantiate, as you said. And thank you for pointing it out. Yeah.
So Bismillah. So I'll take into advisement the idea of putting a better case. I've read several. I have a big file of papers on using Maqāṣid Shari'a in medical ethics, and maybe because I'm a bioethicist and trained clinical ethicist, and I spend time at the bedside helping families adjudicate issues, I've found them to be wanting, all of them, and perhaps that's not right. So charitable brooding is right, but at the bedside, well, I said at the bedside, because if I'm going to stamp someone as an Islamic ethicist at a Islamic hospital, Muslim hospital, and say, here are the tools by which you're going to now take a challenging case, I cannot countenance that usage. I sometimes say that the secular principles are easier because you're dealing with families who may or may not draw from Islam, right? Respecting a person's wishes, right? I mean, whatever, as opposed to, no, we must mandatorily preserve life here, right? I mean, right? Because I don't know what life is. That's my point. This case brought out this notion that if you're going to mandate something, where's all this other construction going on and what's happening in those decision making is a multi-tiered hospital that doesn't have money. And you can do that using principalism in a certain sense, because we don't think about it as hierarchical. They're like principles to balance and think about. There are other ways to do that. And for example, anyway, I don't want to go on that, but that's my concern, perhaps, from this sort of personal experience of thinking about families and cases and issues where there's multiple sides, and looking at how people just write a paper and say, here we go, these are the hierarchical principles, have at it. I agree with you that, and Tariq and I mean, we had a lot of good discussions as part. I am part of the Kyle expert community. We just talk about Maqāṣid all the time, and now he's gone from there, Muhammad Ghali, and how we can specify those. So I agree with you that there is supposed to be specification of some of the models there, and that requires work. So they're maybe not ready for launch, but I wanted to point out some methodological or issues that might arise. As far as why is Islam needed, that's a very good question. I'll say it from a social scientific perspective. It motivates human behavior. People respond. Simple as that. People use, why do they say Islam says this or that? Because we know that it helps. Now, I have papers that show that the exact correlation is not so great, but there is motive power when you invoke the tradition upon human behavior, be it a physician's behavior, be it a patient's behavior, or the family decision maker in medicine, or even a stakeholder like a policy stakeholder, a State Department of Malaysia, and you say to them, okay, well, Islamic blah 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 says that you can't procure this vaccine. They spent $220 million to throw out the vaccine they had that they thought had some porcine components within it and procure another one from China. They didn't. I mean, $220 million. They just threw it down the drain. So it motivates behavior because some scholarly body or some scholarly invested authority has invoked Islam. They're now, some people might not care or might argue, but some people do. So I think that's why I'm not answering why it's needed, but how it's used, right? I think it is needed for people who want to have a life that, so as a physician, a life that is within the bounds of faithful practice of medicine, for example, or a patient, right? I do think people want it for that sort of internal calibration of my actions, my afterlife, my salvation, when they want to have a notion that I'm drawing upon a well that is within our tradition and my behavior is according to that. So I do think that has something to say as well, aside from motivating behavior, that people for a personal purpose, so to speak, and personalists mean afterlife purpose, salvation, want to have something that is tied to the tradition. And even now, how about this? Forget about Muslims. Non-Muslims want it. So why are we commenting on, or I'm asked to comment on a case because because I can write something on it from an Islamic tradition. They want to be pluralistic. They want diversity and inclusion. They want to add some Muslim person there, right? I'm not saying it's all tokenism, but they recognize that there's wisdom within the tradition that might be valuable, perhaps, that there's 5 billion people who might find some resonance from this tradition. And so even non-Muslims find it valuable to think about what other traditions say on things and to better reason themselves, to reflect on the common morality, perhaps, if you think there is one. So in any case, I hope that answers the question. So I actually want some robust notion of Islam, perhaps for various reasons, but what I can't suffice are surface level notions of what Islam says, right? Because then I can say, just find in me Islam, tell me what he's saying, and then we're done, right?
Yeah, if I can I have a quick follow-up, Overmir? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so just a quick follow-up. So I understand that Islam matters to people's lives. I understand that it can matter to political discourse as well. I guess what I mean to say is there a bit of a disservice to people when at the end of the day you're telling us, for instance, the fiqh discourse just says, well, it's all about maslaha, so this works. The Maqāṣid discourse is super general, so you don't really have any specificities. People in general don't really understand the science fully, and the people that do don't tend to be the people on fatwa councils. So considering these variables, I don't know if it's a bit of a disservice to Muslim communities by saying, okay, I understand that you're really concerned about your akhirah, so I'm going to give you some fatwa, some cheap fatwa, because I'm somebody on some council and I've done some studies and you trust me. Perhaps the better way to go is to tell people quite honestly, listen, there's certain core principles of your religion, principles about life, principles about mercy, principles about taking care of families. And then at the end of the day, we as a community need to discuss how we want our ethics to look like in light of the principles that we oftentimes don't even need to refer to texts. We embody as a community through informal teachings.
So that's the throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So my response to that would be, I agree what you're saying, but I think that there's a polar notion, right? That's so I think it's in the sense that when someone gives a fatwa, it's obviously upon the individual to decide whether that fatwa resonates with them and ask their own heart. And right, if someone says there's no fatwa, go consult your own understanding of Islam in your community and the people that you think are ethical exemplars and what your understanding of the Quran is, then it also becomes willy-nilly at times, right? So I think that there's somewhere in between that a community can recognize the ambiguities within the inherited canon and the problems an individual will have trying to just do what they want to do as opposed to what they should do, and find something that suffices, right? And I think that's where we're trying to get to in the middle of that. So not fatwa shopping and not heart, shopping, whatever you want to call it, on the other end. But I think your point, what I thought you were going to say was that, look, what makes something Islamic in discourse? And you're going to go to sort of, Maturidi and Ashari understandings, right? Is there something really, right, Islamic about something here or not? Or is this just a human value that we've labeled, right, with God's description in one way or non-human rationality another way? And therefore we've labeled it just to make ourselves feel better. But in the end, there's no like ontological reality to the Islamic. I thought that's where we're going to go. But that's also another conversation worth having. When we're talking about law now, let's talk about the theological register under which we operate and apply the label of Islamic to anything. So I think, right, I mean, so in any case, I hope I've sufficed. It's a wonderful, and I think there should be a commentary within the volume. So Professor Anjum, about these things, I think these are really important things that go beyond fields, but go and deal with the general structure of authority, values, and the Muslim tradition. And I use the term Muslim particularly.
Right. I mean, I think this raises really, really interesting questions. And the idea of ambiguity is obviously it's not new, right? The Prophet ﷺ acknowledged that he got something wrong about, say, cross-pollination, or in one hadith he says, I give you a judgment based on which of the two parties is more articulate. But if I'm giving you something that is not right, then I'm giving you a piece of fire. And in Islamic tradition, the difference between what qada and diyana being your salvific sort of self, you're standing before Allah, and qada is what the qadi has given you, or the judgment has come. You're ultimately responsible. What the Prophet is saying is doing what is right. But the other dimension of this really fascinating discussion you have brought up, Dr. Padela, again and again, this is of course not the first time that we're talking, is that makes you think, and this is in fact a discussion that does have quite deep classical roots. Why is it that we follow Islamic law? Why do we follow limits by God? Is it itself something in the limits themselves, or is it just that they come from God that matters? And it seems that you read again, that goes back to the question that you mentioned, the theological debate of, is God's judgment completely arbitrary, or is it grounded in our benefit, right? The whole maslaha and then Maqāṣid discourse comes out of Asharism, right? That's the irony. It comes out of Asharism. It comes out of people who say that God's judgment has absolutely no obligation to anyone. It's completely arbitrary. But we can't live without thinking that this law is trying to do something, right? It's coming out of Ghazali, not even an Ashari, like, somebody who could say, it's somebody who's theorizing Asharism, and then he's drawing on Greek wisdom, in fact, to bring wisdom back into the law while excoriating the Mu'tazilis and other people for doing the same thing. So it seems to me that there is we can't make that, we have never made that decision before in the past, right? And that has, in my view, productively moved forward our tradition rather than hampering or ending it. And there is no reason that it could not do the same, right? This tension, these fundamental tensions, well, we can't get into God's mind, but trying to reach it in both ways by saying, you know what, just divine command is enough to me. and I'm looking for that, or where has God hidden his wisdom in this world so that I could respond. I think that that is a worthy pursuit, even if we do not reach the final answer. I do not see any more hands, and we have only 10 minutes left, but I think that probably an act of mercy in Ramadan to end it at this point. Thank you very much once again, everybody. I'll give the last word to Dr. Sharīʿa Naguib to say a prayer and a parting comment.
Assalamu alaikum. Again, thank you very much to all the presenters and to the fantastic contributors to the discussion. Great points. I'm certainly left with several questions and several comments that I will take to the next sessions, inshallah. May Allah bestow His mercy, His guidedness, and His light upon us all, and accept all our works and good deeds and our intellectual endeavors to understand. I pray that we are forgiven any shortcomings. May Allah give us afu and maghfirah, and inshallah we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much.